Okay, so we're going to install Learning Locker. Made this really easy. There's a guide on the Learning Locker documentation site. So go to docs.learninglocker.net and go to installing v2. You'll need some sort of Ubuntu distribution. So I've set up a virtual machine on this laptop running Ubuntu 16. Any Linux distribution should work fine. So you can use Debian or CentOS or RHEL, whatever you like. But we're going to use Ubuntu because it's easiest. So the first step is to make sure that all your packages are up to date, so that the installer has everything it needs when it's running. So depending on what you're using, either yum update or apt-get update. Make sure to run everything as root, otherwise you won't have the required permissions. So it should just take a second. And then also upgrade all of your packages. Okay, everything was already up to date, so that's fine. Now I'm going to copy the install script. You can either use wget or curl, or you can just download it through your browser. So now we've got the deploy script saved in this directory, and we will run it through bash. Make sure you use sudo. Right, the first thing the script is going to do is create a directory to store LL in. By default, that's user local learning locker releases. Inside releases, you'll have a bunch of folders, each with a date on for when that release came out, and a current folder, which is symlinked to the latest release. If you want to roll back, you can just change the symlink from the latest to an older release. So we'll accept all the defaults for the install directories and the symlink directory, and it asks for a user to run everything as. By default, it will create a new user, Learning Locker, but you can use whatever existing web user you have if you have one. I'm going to accept the default to make a new user. LL requires MongoDB as its backend. You can either use your existing installation of Mongo if you've got one in the cloud. I'll show you how to set that up with the .env file later, or you can use one that's installed on a local machine. So the installer will set this up for us locally, so I'm going to just accept that. And the same for Redis. And the same for Clam Antivirus, which is used to scan any uploads. If you're running LL at any sort of scale, you probably don't want to have the database and the application on the same machine. You'd want to move them out to a different cluster. But just for getting things started quickly and getting up and running, doing that is fine. Now we're installing Node, which is used to run all of the LL source code. Alright, so that's the first component of Learning Locker installed. We've got the main APIs and the UI all set up. Just after this, we're now installing the xAPI component. The xAPI handles taking in statements and all the xAPI based endpoints for querying it. Learning Locker is divided into two main parts. There's the Learning Locker core, which is specific to LL. So it's all the stuff that LL needs to run, users, clients, logins, the UI. All of that's in one repository. And then we've got the xAPI stuff, which is everything you need to pass xAPI conformance, and that's in a separate repository. So we finished installing LL core. We just installed the xAPI part. They have separate .env files. So inside the main LL folder, there's an xAPI folder, and inside that, there's a .env for storing all your statements. So that's something to watch out for when you're trying to do configuration. So with the Learning Locker application being multiple different processes, it means that the whole thing is running on several different ports. And each of those ports is responsible for handling a subset of the requests. So to make this transparent to any application that's trying to access LL, we use Nginx as a reverse proxy. So Nginx sits on the server, it checks out what the address of the request coming in, and if it's something xAPI based, it gets forwarded to the xAPI component. If it's something API based, it gets forwarded to LL's APIs. If it's a request for the UI, it goes to the UI. So the installer will set this up for us with all that configuration to do the routing. Now everything's installed, the installer will go and boot everything up. Very soon we should have LL running. So here the installer script has just started up a program called PM2, which is short for Process Manager 2. This runs all of our node processes, make sure they stay up. If they crash, it restarts them. And you can also set it to watch for file changes and then restart. So you can get the status of all of your different Learning Locker processes by running PM2 status. You'll need to switch to the Learning Locker user before you run that. Otherwise, you'll just get a blank list. So the final step is to set up an organization, which lets us store some data. So yes, we'll put an organization name in, HT2. And we'll do admin. And a super secure password. We've got an error here sending emails out to the new admin user because we don't have any mail server configured, but that shouldn't be a problem because we already know our password. Now, if I go to the IP address that I've configured for Vagrant, I can see that Learning Locker is running, and I should be able to log in with the password that I just set. And then I'll see my organization that I also created. There we go, a working